Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this European SDG Roundtable that today will focus on a very interesting topic, that is responsible and transparent tax behavior. And with a number of different stakeholders, we are going, let's say, to take the temperature of where companies, policymakers, and stakeholders stand on this agenda. So you see in this slide here just a recap of what we are going to discuss today. As I said, we tried also with our co-host CSR Sweden, and in a moment I will also give the floor to my colleague. We try, let's say, to put together a varied, let's say, parterre of speakers, not only to give the audience the opportunity to learn about the latest policy development at both European and global level, but also to hear from companies how they are engaging on the path of becoming more transparent and responsible on their tax behavior, but also understand how stakeholders such as civil society and academia are engaging on this agenda and are planning to train new generations and businesses on this very important topic. So just quick technical details. The participants are on mute, so if you have any question, you can use the chat that you see on the right side of your screen. So please, if during the discussion you have some comments or you have already some questions, please write them there. We will gather them and then also use it during the Q&A and open discussion. So indeed, to start the discussion today, I give all of you a warm welcome from both CSR Europe and CSR Sweden. Just before giving the floor to Marian also for some introductory remark, I just wanted, let's say, to set the context for why we are talking about this topic in an SDG Summit. You know, at CSR Europe, we are of course a membership organization with corporate members, but also national partners like our long-standing partner CSR Sweden, and we have a number of activities on different topics, but we have a specific stream of work on what we call markets, and it's where we look at how sustainability is managed within companies, we look at reporting, we look at transparency, and as part of this work, we realized how much we needed to support companies in what we call a total impact disclosure approach, where they not only report on the financials, but they also report on their non-financial performance, and also where the element of tax gets, let's say, a new importance and attention. And that is why we started to look at tax as a fundamental CSR and sustainability issue, and especially in the context of the SDGs and the implementation of such goals, tax assume a very important role, because taxation is the basic tool through which governments can invest in infrastructure, can invest in education, can invest in the health system. And today, more than ever, with the crisis that we are facing still with the COVID-19 pandemic, the role of tax is having even more importance in the recovery of Europe and also in the long-term growth of our continent. So that is why we wanted to have such a discussion on tax responsibility and the role that companies can play on such agenda in becoming more transparent and responsible in their tax planning strategy. And that is why 4 years ago, we started also at CSR Europe to work on this topic and to put in place a number of tools and resources for companies to become more responsible, but also to facilitate the collaboration between CSR and tax department in order to embed sustainability into corporate tax policies and vice versa. So this is just as an introduction why we are discussing this within an SDG Summit, why for us tax is so important. And now I will hand over the floor to Marian Vogel, Executive Director of CSR Sweden, for also sharing with you some initial remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorena. I'm very happy that we're having this session today. It has been a journey, and I think it still is. I think we started to talk about tax as a sustainability topic around 2013, and it has been a privilege to do this together with you at CSR Europe. I think it is an extremely important, but also a sensitive topic. I know that some organizations, some companies have an issue regarding how to communicate, to talk about tax externally and explain the link to sustainability. Internally, I think many times the situation is that the tax department and the sustainability department haven't even met. What I hope now with this work that we are doing in our knowledge hub around tax with many different stakeholders, for example, the University of Lund, member companies as Vattenfall, being a law firm, and also together with you at CSR Europe, that we can make a real change. I think an important key is dialogue, to talk with people, organizations that you don't usually talk to get new insights. And another key is knowledge, training. And I'm very excited to listen to all these experts today. And at the end of this session, my brilliant colleague Daniel will talk and show a bit from this online training that we have been developing during this last year. So let's give the floor to our eminent speakers.
Thank you, Marian, for this. So indeed, we can start moving with our first speaker of the day. And I would like to invite Mr. Bibel to take the floor next. He's head of unit within Tax DG Tax at European Commission, working on direct tax policy and cooperation. And we have invited him because indeed we wanted to hear from you what is the state of play around the number of EU policy development on taxation, since this summer there has been a number of developments related to the action plan for fairer and simpler taxation, and there are still a number of discussions going on and many things also in the pipeline. So we are very happy that you were able to join us. So Mr. Bibel, you have the floor. Thank you.
Yes, hello, thank you. Hello, everybody. Thank you for the organization of this event, this very important event, and also thank you, of course, for the invitation to the Commission and to give us the opportunity to give you a short overview of what is going on our side. Tax behavior is a very important topic. We fully agree with that. And we have made progress, I would say. Whereas a couple of years ago, if you would have asked managers or tax advisors what they understand by tax behavior, most likely a large majority would have said, I need to take measures in order to reduce my tax liability to the maximum I can. And paying tax actually is something that we should avoid. Whereas today, and that's the title of the session, we are not talking about tax behavior, we are talking about responsible and transparent tax behavior. And that is a real change of the game in a certain aspect. I think it is not only the Commission that contributed, it is the cooperation between different stakeholders, including the European Parliament, including the citizens and different organizations, but also to some extent the member states who have their own interest in the area of taxation, in order to make sure that tax behavior is something that is related to fairness. Tax fairness is something that has been on the agenda of the Commission since many years now, and a lot has happened in the past. And to put it in other words, I would say, whereas some people argue the only thing I have to do is to comply with the law that is out there. If I use the loopholes, if I play with the inconsistencies between different legal frameworks, that's fully legal. We have now a situation where we have to say, you may be right, this may be legal, but whether it's legitimate or not, that is a different question. And the borderline of what is legitimate has been shifted. Therefore, fair taxation plays a completely different role than in the past. And that is, of course, also linked to the issue of sustainability. Now, why has this discussion been kicked off? Because we have come from a financial crisis 15 years ago. We had several tax scandals, starting with the Luxembourg leaks to Panama Papers, etc., which have shown that there is unfairness out there. It's unfair if taxpayers pay their fair share, but others have the possibilities to reduce it. And that's triggered the whole set of activities. Let me just quickly go through a few things that have been introduced over the past few years. And it's clear that from a Commission point of view, also looking at the limitations that are there in terms of legislation or legislative power, you should know, and I'm sure you know, that the Commission does not have the competence to harmonize taxation at EU level. That is not given to us by the treaty. What we can do is we can ensure the proper functioning of the internal market. And in particular, if there are tax schemes or tax transactions across the border within the European Union that result in harmful impacts to member states, we can take action. And increasing transparency was one of the pillars over the past few years in order to fight the avoidance and the evasion of taxes. I can refer to one of our key instruments that we call a DAC. DAC is not an animal, but it is a directive, the Directive on Administrative Cooperation, a very important tool in our set of instruments. And there we have introduced a number of additional transparency elements, plus the requirement to exchange information between national tax administrations. Just to mention a few, so-called tax rulings, so arrangements between national tax administrations and taxpayers, which usually are meant to provide tax certainty over a certain period, have also been used in the past to provide some special conditions to certain multinationals. Those tax rulings now have to be uploaded since 3 years on a central database that is accessible to all EU member states administrations. Another extension of that transparency was the exchange of so-called country-by-country reports among national tax administrations, which means that if a global or a multinational group is active in different countries, it has to provide a split up of certain elements per country. And that is important in order to assess whether there is any kind of profit shifting involved. That should not be the case. And let me also mention one of the most recent amendments, that's the so-called Intermediaries Reporting. That is a requirement for intermediaries to report about newly designed and implemented potentially aggressive tax planning schemes. That is a reaction to the request also from some member states and stakeholders to say, we need certain information about new developments at a very early stage. It cannot be that multinationals that are very creative and inspired by tax advisors can set up schemes that exploit certain inconsistencies between the tax systems. And only a couple of years later, if we are lucky, if we have started an audit, for example, we can find out about that when it's too late. So this is a tool that should provide information as early as possible. We have other instruments. We call it, for example, ATAD, Anti-Tax Avoidance Directive, where we go more into the substance of certain things like CFC rules, etc. We have also a code of conduct that is a group organized by the member states that looks at so-called harmful tax practices at the EU level, and has so far abolished quite a number of them. And we have also launched now already twice the so-called CCCTB, which we see as a more long-term solution to the harmonization approach at EU level. But this has been stuck, as well as another initiative. I was talking about CBCR, country by country reporting. The Commission also tabled a proposal on the publication of these country by country reports. And this proposal is still stuck because it did not receive the sufficient support by member states. And that is one of the key issues that we are dealing with. We are working on the basis of unanimity at the Council level, which means the Commission proposals have to be negotiated and approved unanimously by 27 member states, which you can imagine is a difficult procedure. Now, is this a good achievement? Overall, looking back, I would say yes, it is a very good achievement. Over the past years, more than 20 directives have been passed and approved. Is it enough? It's clear that it's not enough. We are doing the following things. We are looking at what we have set up. All the things I mentioned, DAC 3, 4, 5, 6. We are looking at the functioning of this. We have to see whether member states are actually using the information that they are now receiving. And from what we have seen so far, it is the case in some member states that they really exploit the information and follow up to certain indications, whereas in some member states, the follow-up can be improved. So we are looking at that. We are also looking at the amount of information that is going to be exchanged. I mentioned tax rulings. More than 15,000 have been uploaded to the database. I mentioned the code of conduct. More than 100 harmful tax schemes have been abolished. Now, this is good, but we think it's not good enough. In addition, there are new developments. There's a new situation. I don't want to stress the situation that is caused by the unprecedented COVID-19 crisis that has huge consequences for all of us, but also from an economic point of view in the EU and elsewhere. It creates a lot of negative consequences. And the EU, its institutions and the member states and all of us are facing this immense crisis in a fundamentally transformative times, where we also at the same time talk about the digitalization and transforming the economy into a greener economy. These are huge challenges, and we are convinced that fair taxation and sustainable taxation plays an even more important role in this context. And that is the reason why we are still working on this and trying to improve the situation. Now, the first measure, and it was mentioned in the introduction, was that we have issued on the 15th of July a so-called action plan, a tax action plan for fair and simple taxation. Now, that is a big package that consists of an action plan, and I will go a bit more into detail in a second, but also includes a directive proposal, DAC 7, and a communication. Now, what is the key ingredient of that action plan? It's based on two pillars: one, fairness, and two, simplicity. Because we believe that overly complex rules, overly complex procedures also contribute to the fact that the system is unfair. Now, fair taxation remains a top priority, as you see, because it means also protecting public revenues. And the crisis has shown that this is still a key element. I just want to mention the recent discussions on the multi-annual framework and the RRF, the Recovery and Resilience Fund, a huge package that is currently under negotiation at the European Parliament, but that will lead to a huge new fund that will be distributed among member states, but has to be paid back. And that requires that there is, on the other hand, of course, a solid and sustainable income stream at the level of the member states, but probably also at EU level. And that's another debate about the own resources. Now, the package boosts tax fairness by intensifying the fight against tax abuse, curbing unfair tax competition, and again, increasing tax fairness. But at the same time, we think it is important that we also need to help the business and the taxpayers to increase compliance. It's not always the case, if there is a lack of compliance, that this is intentional by the taxpayers. It's often the case that the rules are too complicated, that the procedures are too burdensome, which then leads to non-compliance. And we are looking at that as well. So there's also an element in the action plan to improve the environment for businesses across the EU. I don't go through all the 25 distinct actions that are mentioned in the action plan and that we as a Commission will work on from now on until 2024. But it's a mix of direct and indirect actions. It will, for example, touch upon improving procedures for the refund of withholding tax. It will look at the strengthening of the taxpayers' rights. It will lead to the setup of a so-called tax observatory, a group of experts that should help us to analyze the situation and feed our process with information and figures. We will have a program of so-called cooperative compliance that should establish a new way of relationship between taxpayers and tax administrations. We will also look very deeply into the issue of digitalization, and that does not only mean digitalization on the side of the taxpayers in terms of the business models, but also in terms of the equipment of tax administrations, where a lot has to be done in order to lift and exploit all the synergies that might be there. There are many other points. I don't go into it. You can read it in the action plan itself. Just a few words on the DAC 7 proposal. That is another amendment and extension of our directive on administrative cooperation. And this time, what we are seeking is the reporting by so-called online platforms about sellers, taxpayers that use the platforms to sell services and products. It seems to be the case, and there's evidence out there that it's good that also in Europe more and more platforms develop. That's a good business model, but they also provide the possibility to create profits that are not completely declared afterwards by the sellers. And that's why national tax administrations are seeking that type of information. We're also basing our work on the OECD work, not only in this case, but also in many other cases where there is, of course, the attempt to develop these tools at the global level. But we believe we first build on the global recommendation by developing European hard law is the right step to take. Negotiations are ongoing under the German presidency, and we hope that tangible results can be achieved very soon. And the third element of the July package was the so-called communication on tax good governance. There we try to improve the situation as regards the code of conduct that I mentioned, a good tool, but some people may say it's not transparent itself. So we are looking at the mandate, we are looking at the transparency, and we also have another tool which we call the EU List of Non-Cooperative Jurisdictions. You may also call it a blacklisting of countries that do not play to the international rules of good tax governance. There we are trying to improve the criteria and making sure that national blacklists are more in line with the European and international blacklists. There are other activities. I don't want to go into too much detail. Digital taxation is still one of the big items on the OECD agenda. Of course, also on the European Union agenda. It has just been announced that the results may be slightly postponed to mid of next year. So we are still fully supportive and following this closely in order to increase and improve the fairness in the taxation of digital businesses. And we are also looking into the Green Deal. We have an energy directive that is slightly outdated, which has to be improved in terms of the treatment of fossil resources, etc. And let me close with the last item. We announced initially a so-called communication on the business taxation. This is slightly postponed and will probably be published early next year. So overall, I would say this multifaceted approach to reform taxation in the EU aims to make taxation fairer, greener, and fit for the modern economy. And in that way, it should help to contribute to the long-term sustainable and inclusive growth, at least at the EU level, hopefully even further. So there's a lot on our plate, and thanks to everybody who is actively contributing to this agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bibel, for this extensive overview and for giving us the bigger picture of all the things that are happening around this dossier. And it's very interesting to hear that the EU is putting such an attention on the fair taxation, but also knowing that is not enough, and there are a number of things still to be implemented. Indeed, on the last thing that you mentioned, we also received a question, but you kind of already replied to it. Somebody from the audience wanted maybe to know a bit also what will be in this new communication on business taxation. I don't know if you can give more info than what you already gave, but indeed it was interesting to know also how this fits in the bigger, let's say, global picture. And in a moment, we will also have a representative from the OECD, so she can also update us on this. I don't know if you have something more to add on this last point on the communication on business taxation, or not.
I mean, I can just add, in order to respond to the question, that a big part of that communication was, of course, meant to build on the work ongoing at the OECD. Since that is slightly delayed, we thought it wouldn't make sense at this point in time for us as a Commission to come up with a communication. Now we have postponed it for a few weeks until early next year. There may be a few other points that we are looking at, but the main reason for the postponement was, let's say, the shift of the agenda of the digital taxation work ongoing.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, and I hope you can stay a bit longer with us. So I think now we can move to our panel, also in the interest of time. So basically now in this session, we try to gather, as I said before, also different kind of stakeholders in order to learn from their experience how they're dealing with this agenda, and what are a number of actions put in place within companies, but also from different stakeholders stakeholders like civil society to contribute of making companies more responsible and transparent on their tax behavior. Since we are coming, let's say, from a policy discussion, I think it will be, let's say, consistent to continue on that and maybe ask Mrs. Grace Perez Navarro to take the floor first, to also, let's say, take a step back and look, as I said, at this global picture around tax. You are Deputy Director for the OECD Center of Tax Policy and Administration, and you've been very much involved in all the work of the OECD around tax, the BEPS project, and so on. So, Grace, if you would like to take the floor, and indeed, as I said, set also the global policy context and update our audience on what is happening at OECD level around, let's say, the reform of the international tax system and some of the specific initiatives that you have on your plate. Please, Grace, you can take the floor.
Hello, and thank you very much for this invitation. I hope you can hear me.
And yes, we can hear you and see you very well.
Okay. Okay, very good, because I'm receiving a message saying I've been muted by the technical administration. Anyway, okay. I'm very happy to be here to talk about the OECD's work on international taxation. We have, since the financial crisis in 2008, really stepped up our efforts in tackling both tax evasion and tax avoidance. And I think it's important to talk about both of them, even though I know you're focused on the corporate sector, because it is about the wider issue of fairness. And so in order to have fairness in the overall system, you have to ensure that you're covering tax evasion by individuals, companies, and then also the wider issues of tax avoidance. And so we first focused our efforts after the 2008 financial crisis on tax evasion. And I think we've had a great success in improving the transparency and the sharing of information among countries to tackle tax evasion by eliminating bank secrecy, establishing beneficial ownership measures, et cetera. And so the 161 members of the Global Forum have been working on this, taking forward the peer reviews of all members to ensure that these standards have been implemented in a consistent manner. And we also, as a support to all of this, have a multilateral convention for sharing information where we have 141 jurisdictions, including all financial centers, participating in this comprehensive instrument that allows for all forms of exchange of information, which is quite significant. We had started with exchange of information on request, which is one form of exchange which requires you to detect something in an audit. But then we moved to automatic exchange of financial account information, so banking information, in 2014. And the results we have seen have been very impressive. We have had 96 jurisdictions exchange financial account information automatically in 2019. We should shortly have the figures for 2020 because they usually report around this time. And then we've had information on 84 million financial accounts exchanged in 2019 with a total value of around 10 trillion euros, so quite substantial. More than 102 billion euros of additional revenue has been identified by countries through voluntary disclosure programs that have been built around this automatic exchange of information, and also similar initiatives and offshore investigations have produced these impressive results. We've also seen a decline of 24% of bank deposits in offshore financial centers, which represents 410 billion US dollars in international financial centers over the past decade. So that's what we've done in the tax evasion side. Now, what have we done in terms of tackling aggressive tax planning by multinationals? Well, I think most of you will have heard of the BEPS project, which we launched in 2013 to try to tackle the artificial profit shifting by multinationals. which we conservatively estimate cost countries 100 to 240 billion US dollars in lost revenue annually, which is the equivalent of 4 to 10% of the global corporate income tax revenue. So quite significant. And again, as I say, this is a conservative estimate. We did produce 15 actions in 2015 to help countries tackle tax avoidance, improve the coherence of the international tax rules, and ensure a more transparent tax environment. Now, Mr. Biebel had talked about transparency as being a key component of the EU initiatives, and it is also something that is very important to the OECD initiatives. We have established, and just to give you a few examples, the country-by-country reporting, which to date over 90 jurisdictions have implemented, meaning that more than 2,500 bilateral exchange relationships of this information have been established. We have now already launched a public consultation on how to improve the country-by-country reporting. And this was launched in February. We had a hearing or public meeting on this in May, and now the members of the inclusive framework, there are 137 member jurisdictions of the inclusive framework, are reviewing the input that they received to revise these rules. On Action 5 of the BEPS project, we have spontaneous sharing of previously secret rulings. This was also mentioned by the EU. We have had over 30,000 exchanges of information on tax rulings over the last few years. This ensures increased transparency for tax administrations so that they are able to more quickly identify potential risks. We've also had mandatory disclosure through the Action 12 recommendations and this I think was also described by the EU, to require taxpayers and their advisors to disclose aggressive tax planning arrangements. So these are some of the transparency elements of the BEPS package. There were also elements to tighten up the rules of tax treaties. We created a multilateral legal instrument to do that. We strengthened the transfer pricing rules. All of these things show that governments in their frustration feel compelled to ask for more and more information of taxpayers and their advisors as a way to try to identify and manage risks, and also to try and deter aggressive tax planning, which unfortunately adds more burdens and compliance costs to all multinationals, on those who are responsible in their tax conduct as well as those who are not. So we need to think about, do we continue on this path of continuing to add more and more reporting requirements, or how do we try to find perhaps other ways to curb the appetite of multinationals for aggressive tax planning? Now, our work on the tax challenges of digitalization has been mentioned, and there are two pillars to this work, which we released blueprints of earlier this month. There's Pillar 1, which focuses on developing new taxing rights and addressing the issues of nexus and profit allocation. The second pillar is about creating a minimum tax, which is not limited to digital companies. It's really designed to ensure that large multinationals pay a minimum level of tax. And both of these pillars have been put out for public consultation. We are seeking written comments by December 14th, and we welcome views from all stakeholders on this. This minimum tax could be a real game changer. And it does reflect governments' frustration that no matter what rules they put in place, there will always be those who seek to circumvent those rules through artificial, but mostly technically legal means. So setting a minimum level of tax that must be paid will make such tax planning much less attractive and does help ensure that tax is paid where economic activities occur and value is created. It is yet another way to force companies to change their behavior, but wouldn't it be better if companies voluntarily change their behavior and move towards more responsible business conduct? The whole issue of responsible business conduct is covered in some wider work of the OECD that goes beyond taxation. And that is in the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, which were published in 2011. These guidelines really are trying to get multinationals to change their behavior in a whole range of policy areas. I should say that tax is the last chapter in those guidelines and the shortest one, but they are very important in terms of trying to set some basic principles around what responsible business conduct means in the tax area. These recommendations are recommendations from government to business operating in or from the countries adhering to these guidelines, which I think is about 46, 47 countries. The purpose of these guidelines is to ensure business operations are in harmony with government policies across a wide range of issues, that they strengthen the basis of mutual confidence within society, so back to the whole issue of fairness and trust, to help improve foreign investment climate and to enhance the contribution to sustainable development. These have been endorsed by business, trade unions, and civil society organizations. Now, what do they say about taxation in this very short chapter? Well, first, they say that businesses should comply with both the letter and the spirit of the tax laws and regulations of the countries in which they operate. They also say that businesses should provide relevant information to tax authorities in a timely manner. They also say that enterprises should treat tax governance and tax compliance as important elements of the oversight and broader risk management systems of business. And importantly, they say that corporate boards should adopt tax risk management strategies to ensure that financial, regulatory, and reputational risks associated with tax are fully identified and evaluated. Getting these references to complying with the letter and spirit of the law into these guidelines was no easy feat. Business fought fiercely against that. It was also a struggle to get these references to the role of the board in managing tax risks like other tax risks. But I think today that is much more widely accepted than it was 10 years ago. Our OECD G20 principles of corporate governance also refer to the importance of boards managing tax risk at the board level. So these are important overall principles that should help guide business responsibility in the tax area. We've also tried to tackle this issue through work reinitiated recently on the whole issue of tax morale. What is it that drives individuals and businesses to pay tax and to pay tax responsibly? Now, this is easier to determine when we're talking about individuals. You just ask them. But for corporates, it's a little bit trickier because they are legal entities and so don't have morale per se. But it is very important because the largest businesses are responsible for around half of total tax revenue, even though they only represent 2% of corporate taxpayers. So it's really important to try to get those large businesses to comply in a responsible way and voluntarily. Our tax morale study used a survey of businesses on tax certainty as a proxy for determining the level of multinationals' tax morale, looking at perceived levels of uncertainty and the impact of that uncertainty on investment and restructuring decisions. We have also looked to tax administrations. We've surveyed them and asked for their perceptions of multinationals' tax behaviors. We haven't published this information yet, but it does show that there is a wide spectrum of perception of behavior across regions around the world. There are some areas where there's good performance everywhere, and that is paying tax on time. That is, businesses do want to comply with the letter of the law, so they do pay on time. I guess the question is the amount they're paying on time the right amount of tax to be paid? Now, we look less positively in certain areas when we look at trust issues, especially in Latin America and Africa, where the majority of respondents have said that they think multinationals and large businesses are not open and not transparent with tax authorities, and that the information that is provided cannot be trusted. So these are concerning results that we have seen, but also a complement to the information we gathered from multinationals. And so our next step in this work will be to try to bring tax authorities and businesses together to talk about these different perceptions. I think the other thing that is important to look at beyond just government and international initiatives like ours or the EU initiatives is to look at how business-led initiatives can have an impact. And I was very interested recently to be talking to some of the largest investment funds in the world, government investment funds, pension funds. And you'll see, for example, the Norges Bank Investment Management has established tax and transparency principles that they will use in their investment decisions. And this is something that could really change business behavior, because it will affect them, you know, at the bottom line, basically, because if major investors like government pension funds are not going to invest in businesses that do not engage in responsible business conduct, then that will affect their bottom line, and that may make them rethink their tax policies, because it will present a financial risk not to do so. Other initiatives like the B-Team Responsible Tax Principles, which a number of businesses have joined, I think are also very positive developments. And companies, I think, will need to continue moving down this path, because this whole issue is going to become much more important in the context of a post-COVID environment. Governments have spent millions and millions, billions actually, on trying to support individuals and businesses during this crisis. And so the public's tolerance for aggressive tax planning will hit new lows. So I think it is important now more than ever for businesses to focus on this issue of trying to pay tax in a responsible manner. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace, for this very insightful overview, and also with your last call on business to take this agenda seriously, and also to recall the role that responsible tax behavior plays today. I think it was also very interesting to learn about this study around tax morale as also an element always that falls in a gray area, but as we heard also from Mr. Bibel, we have also the understanding that the line of what is legitimate now has been shifted, and there is this willingness to go beyond only the letter of the law, but also respect the spirit that goes with it. And I think also the mention that you made about the investors community in the bigger picture around sustainable finance, and also here in Europe we speak a lot about the element of tax should become more and more an element of assessment of investment from governments, but also from private entities. Now, I think it's time to move to some of the other speakers of the panel. And first, I would like to turn to the two companies that are part of this panel, because indeed it would be interesting to hear from two companies that both have experience in putting in place responsible tax policies and also try to enhance the transparency around it. It is important to also hear what have been some of their challenges and opportunities. And I would like to ask first to José Luis Migoya to take the floor. He is International Tax Director at Iberdrola, a Spanish energy company. And I would like to ask you, José, if you can give us an overview, of course, of your work within Iberdrola on responsible and transparent tax policies. What have been, as I said, some of the challenges and opportunities that came with it, including also the engagement with internal and external stakeholders. So, José, you have the floor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And first of all, I want to thank you for the opportunity of sharing my thoughts with you about this topic. It's not the first time, and I hope it will not be the last one. So, we are going to talk about responsible and transparent tax behavior. And if we talk about Iberdrola, I would say that, Iberdrola and others, but in the case of Iberdrola, you don't become to be transparent from one day to the other. This, as it's been said at the beginning, is a journey that we started some time ago, and we became more transparent than we were in the past, but during this journey and this process. No, if I would have to choose one milestone for this journey to be important, it would be 2010, when after some months of work between the Spanish tax administration and the big taxpayers in Spain, it was published a code of good tax practices that was voluntary for the companies, and Iberdrola, being one of the main companies in Spain, decided to adhere to this code and to apply this code. This was the beginning of what we now have as a tax policy. And this tax policy, and I think it's an important driver, is as part of the corporate governance model framework. It's one other policy, as we have a risk policy or other policies in that framework, and the tax policy is one of those. I've talked about transparency, but if you say, what about being responsible? Responsible, again, is not something that you become from one day to the other. I could say that in a group like Iberdrola, we have always been very prudent and conservative, and I would say it means we were responsible in the past, but probably we were not transparent enough to let the others know that we were also responsible at that time. And maybe we were not also aware that we were so responsible as we were and as we are. No, but well, I think that both things are together, and one thing brings you to the other. No, going back to the tax policy, that I think that is the key issue of this transparency and responsible behavior. Our tax policy includes some principles and some good tax practices. It declares that our strategy is to serve to the business. We follow our business lines. We are at the service of them, but at the same time, what we are saying is that we will be taxed in the place where we are generating value. So we are stuck to the substance. At the same time, it has been said before by the other participants, it's a must to be compliant with the legislation, but we also say that very clearly in our tax policy. And at the same time, we don't leave our responsibility of looking for the social interest, meaning by social interest, at the end, to improve the value for our shareholders. So we need to balance to be fair tax and to pay taxes where we generate value, but at the same time to defend the interest of the corporation and our shareholders, which means that we will defend a reasonable interpretation of the legislation, and we will be collaborative with the tax authorities, but at the same time we will defend our positions at the time we believe it's something we can argue and we can support. We also say that we need to identify the tax risks in our behavior, and we need to minimize the tax risks. And which is very important in the tax policy is what is the role of the board of directors in that policy, in the implementation and in the monitoring of the tax policy. And I think that's a key issue too. The board of directors is in charge, is responsible for approving investment decisions and other transactions, and they have to be informed of the tax matters when they are relevant in that decisions. And legally, at least in Spain, they are responsible for these tax risk and these tax matters. This is important, and it means that we also have to put in place a system so our board of directors is aware of what's happening, but not only in the parent company, but around the world in the group. We are operating in different countries. We have a system that all the countries have to apply the same or very similar tax policies. There is a reporting channel to the audit committees of those holdings in the different countries where we operate, and from those holdings to the audit committee of the parent entity. So there is a whole system of reporting and a channel of communication. So at the end, the board of directors of the parent entity is aware of what's happening, and there is a reporting for the global tax director at least twice every year after the closing of the financials, and then in July, after it's supposed we have already filed the tax returns, income tax returns in most of the countries. So at least those 2 times there is a direct and in person, maybe not at these times, but virtual presence at this time on the audit committee to report about the level of compliance about this tax policy. This tax policy is updated from time to time. Very important, as I have said, is a global tax policy, is to be applied globally and updated. The last update we made on this tax policy, that is publicly available in our website, was in July, and it was to include a reference to the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, to include a reference to the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises that has already been mentioned before, and to make a mention to the importance of compliance and certification about compliance issues. So we keep this policy update from time to time. And we also include in this tax policy, which is also important and related with this transparent and responsible behavior, some red lines that we don't want to cross. We clearly say that we don't work with tax havens. We don't work with artificial schemes. We will avoid any fraud schemes, and if we are aware of any fraud scheme, we will collaborate with the tax authorities in order to remove those schemes. And also, we will not be using special purpose vehicles unless there is a structure and acquisition, and we need to include in the acquisition those entities. And in that case, we apply special procedures and special approvals from the board of directors and the audit committee in order to move forward with these kind of structures. It's also very important that the tax policy expressly says that one of the main contributions to the society is the tax contribution, the taxes we pay to the different tax administration. And here I would like to remark that when we say the taxes we pay, it's very important to refer to all the taxes we are paying, not only to the income tax. Sometimes you see some instruments to measure the level of responsibility of a group in the tax area, and they only rely on the income tax. I think that's a mistake, and that's not fair for the multinationals, not fair for the taxpayers. You need to rely on the whole picture. If I talk about Iberdrola is paying around more than 40% of the earnings, and in some countries, more than 50% of the earnings are paid as taxes. And in some countries like the US, we don't pay income tax. But it's not because we are not responsible. We're investing thousands of millions of dollars in the US. We are creating thousands of jobs in the US, but we are applying legislation that in this case is promoting the use of renewable energy. And the result of that is that during some years we are not paying income taxes. We will pay that in the future probably. And does this mean that we are not responsible? Not at all, not at all. So it's unfair to rely only on the income tax. I think we look at the whole picture. We have in place some instruments in order to take the tax policy to practice. We have to include a tax opinion in any investment dossier. We need to include a qualification of the level of risk of any transaction that is going to be submitted to the operating committee or to the board of directors. We have in place a public transparency report that we make publish every year, where we include the amount of taxes we are paying on each country and the different taxes we are paying. We also have a communication to the tax authorities, in this case in Spain, where we report to them the main issues of the previous year. So I think that there are a lot of instruments that we have in place in order to say that we are transparent, and as a consequence of this transparent, I think we are also more responsible than if we were not transparent. I think there is a lack of pedagogy, not from our side, that we need to improve the communication with different stakeholders, but I think we don't have support enough of the tax authorities and other bodies like some NGOs and so on, because there is like a message that the multinationals are not paying the fair level of taxation, and I think that's not fair. There are some taxpayers that maybe are in that side of the line, and other taxpayers are not. And I think there is a lack of intention in some tax authorities to support the good taxpayers, and I think it should be also be important. We have talked about responsible tax behavior, but we have I'm sorry for saying that. In the first two panelists, I have only heard about responsible tax behavior of the taxpayers. I would also like to include in the equation responsible tax behavior of the administrations, for example. I think this is a win-win situation. We need to put together taxpayers and administration. We need to be transparent both, and we need to be responsible both, not only taxpayers. I'll try to finalize because I think I'm out of time. I think it's key, the role of CSR teams. We need to go with them because they have the contact and the feeling of the different stakeholders. So for us, CSR people are key, are relevant when trying to translate our numbers into communication. I think we need to be very proactive. We need to build trust. It's been said at the beginning, the trust is key. I agree with that. Again, we need to build a win-win situation between taxpayers, administrations, and other stakeholders. And finally, I think that in this global world where the information is huge and it flows very quick, we need new processes. We need new controls on those processes. We need to have very clear where are the risks. We need to put controls on those risks, and that will make easier the relationship between taxpayers and the rest of stakeholders. And very important, and I will finish with that, I think that we need new resources and new skills in our tax teams. We need not only very good technical people in the tax area, but we also need tax people who is able to analyze the data, to extract results of the data, and also to communicate properly to the different stakeholders. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose, for sharing your journey and Iberdrola's journey with us. I think it's important, as you said also at the beginning, to remind that this doesn't happen overnight. Is a journey that takes a number of elements with it. Of course, the compliance with the legislation, but also a company culture that has a certain appetite to, let's say, behave in a more responsible way, but also I think the point around the management involvement, the board buy-in is key to get things moving within the company. Also the engagement with other teams like the CSR1, and of course the engagement with external stakeholders. So thank you very much for this. Now I would like to see if we can move to the other company representative that we have with us today, or we should have, Mr. Tegelberg from Vattenfall. Just wanted to check if you eventually managed to join and we can hear. Perfect. We can see you, and I hope we can hear you. So please, you have the floor. The question for you is also a bit the same as for Jose. So we would like to hear from you your perspective and experience within Vattenfall in putting in place a number of responsible tax policies, and share with the audience what some of the challenges and opportunities have been in this work. So please, Anders, you have the floor.
Yes, thank You
think the connection is not very good. I don't think that we can hear you, or at least I don't. I don't know if the others could hear him. I think the connection is a bit bad, and now the video is frozen. So maybe in the meantime, that perhaps Anders try to reconnect. Also, in the interest of time, maybe we can move already to our next speakers, and then if he managed to connect again, we give him the floor. So to move to the next speaker, so we will move to another very important stakeholder at the table. And I'm very happy that Tove accepted our invitation. She works for Eurodad as a policy and advocacy manager, and we are really happy to have you with us, because we really believe that, as also some of the speakers mentioned, the engagement from companies together with the other stakeholders like civil society is very important to bring the discussion forward and to hear also your perspective on this topic. What are your expectations towards businesses and how you are engaging perhaps with them on this agenda? And of course also we would like to hear what is the state of play of your work around tax within Eurodad, in terms also of the global and the general context around what unsustainable tax behavior causes within the bigger societal framework. So, Tove, you have the floor. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. And also thank you to the other speakers for already, I think, a very interesting panel. I hope I can contribute to that. And yeah, in terms of learning from experience, well, with the international corporate tax system, we have almost 100 years to learn from. It is the basics of this system are very old. And of course, we can already see now that this has been a very political issue for a long time, and for very, very good reasons. And I've written down 3 challenges that I think we need to learn from. And the first one is that the international corporate tax rules are extremely complex. The transfer pricing system and the arm's length principle, there's a number of problems with that approach. First of all, it's built on some assumptions that, of course, aren't true in reality. To assume that a subsidiary of a corporation in one country is independent from a subsidiary of the same corporation in another country is that's fiction. But at the same time, the transfer pricing guidelines and the international system covers a very large amount of documents and rules, and are in many instances quite unclear. And that's, of course, a problem from several perspectives. First of all, it creates the chance of the loopholes, and it's already been said very clearly that we have a very large problem with international corporate tax avoidance. And that, of course, also means that for the corporations that are not using the loopholes, there is an unfair competition. One very clear example of that is small and medium enterprises. They can't use international structures to avoid taxes. And they often end up paying more tax than multinational corporations. But at the same time, and the CSR debate in this context is interesting because, of course, it can also bring up the question, well, should we as a corporation use every trick in the book to lower our tax rates? And we're quite sure that there are corporations that say, no, actually, we want to go more in the direction of the spirit of the law than to try to really bring our tax rates as low as possible. But that then means, especially if we have cases where a corporation pays less than 1% in tax, it's a very clear problem that becomes for the corporation to decide whether they want to do that or not. It's very clearly a failure of the tax rules. There are other problems as well for the cooperation. It was mentioned before that it would be good to have the same rules in one country compared to another country. But of course, when the international framework is so unclear, we also get a lot of variance in the interpretation of the rules. But we also get some countries that try unilaterally to impose other types of rules, as we see a lot at the moment. And then there is a problem, lastly, on the interpretation over the long term. I think one very important example of this is the European Commission's state aid cases. We find it very important that the Commission takes up examples of extreme corporate tax avoidance and raises that and flags this problem. But of course, it's obvious that some of these instances and examples that are being addressed in state aid cases now sometimes go decades back. So we're discussing whether tax that was paid 15 years ago was the right amount. And of course, in some cases, we have extremely large pots of money that we're talking about. We have billions of euros being discussed in these state aid cases that are now at the courts. And so there is a question, even 10, 15 years after in the corporation is, well, we wonder how much tax at the end of the day we will end up paying. So as civil society, we're obviously not blind to the fact that this is a very difficult environment to navigate in. So that's the one thing that we need to learn from. The second one I had noted down was on the transparency. The tax system that we have at the moment and the rules we have on public reporting mean that basically a corporation doesn't have to disclose publicly even the top level numbers on how much corporate income tax they pay in each country where they operate and where they have the business activities. And this is the discussion that's been called public country by country reporting and has been going on for many years. Now, I should be clear, we are strongly in favor of public country by country reporting. And it has been introduced in the European Union for banks. But the discussion about transparency, I think it's important to distinguish between what we mean, because sometimes when we hear that the transparency has been introduced, it's not actually public transparency. It's a secret exchange of information between tax administrations. And of course, from the perspective of the public, that's still not transparent. So when we talk about public country by country reporting, what we're talking about is really public transparency. And of course, there are many reasons why this is important. First of all, the experiences from the banking sector is that it seems to be lowering the level of corporate tax avoidance. But secondly, there's also another unfortunate effect of the secrecy that we have about corporate tax payments. And that is the general uncertainty and the fact that it's very difficult to see which corporation is doing better, which corporations are trying to actually have a higher standard and pay more taxes than they would if they used all the loopholes to the max. And this is to be seen in the context of the fact that it's very difficult to keep information secret today. We can see that from the leaks today. It takes very little effort to copy a hard disk and send it to a journalist. And of course, we can see that the corporate tax debate is very much driven by these scandals, and the news value of these leaks increases because of the fact that this is secret information that has come out. And of course, this has contributed to an extreme level of a public mistrust in the tax system and in multinational corporations. But because we don't have public information, it's very difficult to distinguish and say, well, it was this corporation that had the problem, but we can see that this corporation is not part of the problem. And so right now it just creates a very, very high and general level of mistrust. And the third concern and problem that I think we need to learn from, which I wrote down, is about how these rules came to be, how they were decided. And of course, as we know, the international decision-making has for a long time been led by the OECD. We can see 5 years ago that the BEPS package was adopted, and it was more than 100 developing countries that were not invited to take part in the negotiation of the BEPS package, which is a very, very big international decision. It's almost 2,000 pages long. And then after the BEPS package was adopted, and also after developing countries really pushed hard to have a process under the United Nations to discuss the international tax rules, of course, the inclusive framework was established. But in order to join the inclusive framework, developing countries have to sign on to BEPS. And so they would be signing on to rules that were decided in a forum where they were not able to participate. And this has caused a discussion about whether or not developing countries want to join and whether or not the rules are in their interest. And so we still have a situation where a third of the world's governments have decided not to join the inclusive framework. And for the least developed countries, it's actually 2/3 that have decided not to join. Now, of course, the first thing is that, and I think there are numerous examples of how developing countries' interests are not well covered in the international tax rules. But secondly, the level of ownership is not very strong. And of course, developing countries have less ownership of rules they haven't been part of negotiating. Even at the level of OECD countries, we also have the problem that the international rules have not created a peace agreement. In fact, the reason why we now have the second round of negotiations going on within a short time frame is that also the OECD countries started to introduce unilateral measures and get into discussions. So we have international tax as an area of conflict. There is an enormous amount of politics and blacklisting and fights about who sets the rules and who gets to be in the room. And this is a concern for us as well. There's an extra concern related to the fact that the negotiations are very secret. Compared to negotiations at the United Nations, it's difficult to see which government is saying what. The meetings are not allowing observers to participate. It's even difficult sometimes to find out which negotiating text is actually being negotiated. And that also means that it's difficult for us as civil society to pressure for more ambitious decisions. So to also look at the European aspect, I would also say that the Code of Conduct group is a bit of a similar problem, is that there is a very high level of secrecy. And that means that there's mistrust, but also I would say, I think that's also a reason why the decisions in the Code of Conduct group in the EU have not been more ambitious. And that creates the problem that there's actually a lot of good proposals. Mr. Vogel mentioned, for example, the CCCTB and the public country-by-country reporting proposal. There's a lot of these good proposals that the Commission have put on the table, the European Parliament has supported, but when it gets to the member states, it's difficult to get adoption also because, especially on tax issues, they need to all agree. But the fact that the meetings aren't public also makes it harder for public pressure to really result in higher levels of ambition. So to wrap up, obviously there are a number of good examples to learn from. Public country-by-country reporting, more transparency is going to help both on reducing corporate tax avoidance and on building public trust. There are also good examples of alternative tax rules, alternatives to the transfer pricing system, including the Commission's CCCTB proposal. So really benefiting from that. And there are also examples of international negotiations at the United Nations that are more transparent, where all countries are at the table, and that allows for progressive alliances of countries to take form. We're not seeing at the moment alliances of countries that really want more action on this, but this is something we've seen in many other international negotiations. But unfortunately, we don't feel that the current negotiations that are being led by the OECD are really learning as much as we should from this. There's still a problem with the fact that it is not fully inclusive. It is not a truly global forum. And unfortunately, the rules that are on the table are also not introducing the kind of transparency that we want. And we also feel that there's actually a risk that the tax system is getting more complex rather than less complex. So very much welcome this debate and this opportunity to speak to you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tove, for your remarks and for putting the spotlight on some of the discrepancy of the international tax system, some of the concerns that you have, rightly so, from your perspective and contribution from civil society representative, but also to make the point about transparency. We're also talking about public transparency, of course, as a main tool to rebuild trust and also for companies to be more consistent with some of the other commitments that they have on the sustainability area. Now I will quickly move to, let's say, the other section that was the reaction from the audience. I see that there is already a lot of interaction in the chat, so this is very good. I would like to give the floor to Professor Beate Schofield. She accepted our invitation, and we are very happy also to bring the input from the academia on such an agenda. So thank you, Beate, for being with us, and please share with us your reactions, comments, and also your point of view and take on this agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the very interesting presentation so far in the session. This could really have been a full-day conference. There's so much to discuss. But as we're behind time, I will keep my comment very short. My area of research is company law and corporate governance, which I have worked on in the context of sustainability for quite a few years now. And I see corporate purpose, corporate governance, and the duties of the board as a connecting factor for many sustainability issues, including tax. Because I believe that a part of the reason that we have seen this drive, which we hopefully now are beginning to shift away from, towards so-called tax optimization, where their idea has been to have pay as little tax as possible, that it is a part of the reason for that is the shareholder primacy drive, the social norm that dictates that companies are owned by shareholders, and that the duty of the board is to maximize returns for shareholders. That is not the law. That is not company law. As we've seen, we've done a lot of comparative and also increasing the interdisciplinary research in this area. So we know that it is not the law. But in this clash of norms where the OECD guidelines are an important factor, but not enough to push back against the strong social norm of shareholder primacy, we see that this drive has had a lot of influence also in the area of tax. But I'm very happy to see that the discussion is changing now. It's not so many years ago that we in Oslo had a seminar about tax, and we discussed whether what role tax lawyers should have when they advise their business clients, and it was totally rejected by some practitioners that they should have any kind of responsibility for what they propose to their clients. But I think this is changing now. So from the perspective of the SMART project that I coordinated, we think that as a key factor in shifting towards more sustainable business. Also, when it comes to tax, that we should redefine the corporate purpose and the duties of the board as a matter of company law, with sustainability due diligence as a core duty, which is not limited to environment and not limited to human rights, but includes all aspects of sustainability, which also include tax. So that is the proposal that we make, and we think this would also have the mission of reducing the need for more and more disclosure requirements, which have tended to mostly create problems for business that try to do things in a responsible and proper way, and not really prevented business that have been working in an unsustainable way, because a lot of the disclosure coming from business is neither relevant nor reliable. But if we integrate this into the duties of the board, then we have a basis for reliable and relevant information from business, including on their tax policies, which then makes it much easier for the responsible businesses. Like we've heard some examples of business talking today about how they deal with these issues, to give them the competitive advantage instead of that staying with the business that are unsustainable in different ways. I look very much forward to the discussion. I'm sorry that we don't have more time, but I hope this will be only one instance where we can meet and discuss these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Beate, for your input. It's very interesting to hear about your proposal. So thank you for sharing it with us. Indeed, we are almost at out of time. But as I propose also to the speakers, we will just extend the session for another 5 to 10 minutes, so we are able to get at the end of our agenda. Also because the next speaker is also from CSR Sweden, and he has a very exciting project to share with all of you. So with no further ado, you will give all the information, Daniel. So please, you can take the floor.
Great. Thanks very much, Lorena. I hope my audio is good, yeah?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Wonderful, thanks. And I'll try to keep this a little bit quick. What I can start with to say is that I've been working in the corporate sustainability arena, CSR arena, for probably almost 2 decades now. And what I can share with you is that recently, actually within the last week, I was at a network event, little digital mingle with a lot of other sustainability practitioners. And this was one of many instances where, in kind of mentioning kind of the things I've been working with, and I mentioned corporate tax and sustainability, the response is, what do you mean corporate tax and sustainability? It's just not on a lot of people's radar. And this happens time and time again. And I guess what also happens, the second reaction after kind of sharing some insights about tax revenue loss connected to corporate tax avoidance and what that means, the implications for society and the planet, it's an immediate recognition, and the response is always, this is really important, tell me more. And being sustainability practitioners, you always get these questions, what's the regulatory framework, what are the initiatives, who are the leading companies, how can I learn more? And what's interesting is my own kind of story around this is relatively recent, and it basically was about a year ago when CSR Sweden and Vattenfall had an event in Sweden, and it's like a week-long event called Almedalen, and there we go. Maybe it's world famous, maybe it's world famous only for us in Sweden, but Vattenfall organized together with CSR Sweden an event during this week of thousands and thousands of events around sustainable taxation. And it was through this event that I also had my own aha moment, when a researcher from Lunds University in Sweden, Axel Hilling, was up on stage, and he related corporate taxation and the losses related to corporate tax avoidance related to the SDGs. And he came to this very resonating punchline that therefore tax is a sustainability issue. And that is when, for me, I recognize that this is something that really ought to be more widespread and on more people's agenda. Interestingly, at this event, there were other kind of insights shared around a consumer perspective and an investment perspective. There were insights around how the culture has been changing within tax advisory. Also, Anders Tegelberg from Vattenfall, who almost shared his experience with us this afternoon. He was on stage and he shared his journey, how he navigated through the organization and culture at Vattenfall to publish a tax policy, to develop governance models and implement that. So it was enlightening for me, and as somebody that works in sustainability, I work a lot in textiles and in food. I've worked with environmental issues. I work with social issues, fair trade, ethical recruiting of migrant workers, lots of different issues. And I work very often with developing education programs around sustainability. And the themes that were shared on the stage that day are very often themes that are found, they're very prevalent in education programs around sustainability. So around culture and the people and planet and so forth. And of course, there are a number of other predominant themes that pop up in all of the kind of the education programs I've worked with. And we've heard about some of those this afternoon, the systemic issues, the history. We talk about power imbalance. There are always advocacy groups involved, CSOs. There's an investor perspective that was brought up today, voluntary initiatives, regulatory frameworks. And all of these things are very relevant for this theme of corporate tax and sustainability. So basically, all of the elements are there, and there is a very clear sense that there's a need for more awareness. Now, a lot of the people, everybody engaged today, and very likely a lot of the people that have stitched into this the session this afternoon have a degree of awareness around this. But I'm quite certain that there are a lot of practitioners on the sustainability side and even on the tax side that maybe have some insight, but not a whole lot. So when it was decided between CSR Sweden and Lund University to develop a course in this, basically, one of the questions is, how do you bring to bear all of the insights, all of the knowledge that's valuable, and how do you do it in an engaging way and a time-effective way? So basically, Axel Hilling, who was on stage there in Almedalen, he reached out far and wide through his network and basically assembled a stable of leading scholars and practitioners and experts to contribute to this course. You've met some of them already this afternoon. You almost met Anders. And in addition to these, there are a number of others that we've brought in. And they've all contributed with content, with insights. We've had sessions with them. I won't go through all of them, but it was interesting that it was brought up the investor perspective. So for the course, we've brought in UNPRI, the Principles for Responsible Investment, Vaishnavi Ravishankar. We've brought in a planetary perspective, a professor of ecological economics from Australia, Bob Costanza. We brought in a Big Four perspective, Grant Wardell Johnson from KPMG Australia. Tax Justice Network, John Christensen, and a host of others. So basically, this is where the content comes from. This is the core of the content, and the audience then is basically the two target audiences. It's sustainability professionals and it's corporate tax professionals. That's the primary audience. It's very likely going to be a valuable course for other business functions, for civil society organizations, even investors. And actually, Jose brought up something interesting. It might be an interesting course for tax authority professionals. And what's always important in courses like this, and the courses I've been involved with, is that for professionals, one of the number one things we have to think about and be aware of is that there's a time press. So it's always got to be very time effective. And in basically curating and packaging the material, it has to be easy to navigate, it has to be easy to get back to the information you want to maybe review again. And what I can say is that this course has been developed from a broader perspective. It's not a deep dive, but it's a broader perspective. And the whole ambition is to get this information out there, to spread it where it's not being spread already. So to ignite the conversation where it's not being discussed today, and to get that engagement to then move into deep dives. For instance, the activities at CSR Europe, the masterclass, the self-assessment, those kind of programs. So this is to get the conversation started. The course is now being pilot tested by a handful of companies, and the target is to launch it at the end of November. It's divided into 3 modules, and hard to say right now, it'll be at least a 3-hour course. Right now the content is longer than that, but that's what the pilot test is about, to see if we how we prioritize that content. So it might be it'll be at least 3 hours, but it could be something more than that. What I can also say is that in addition to the professional community, the course actually is already launched, and it's launched in a separate version for students, for universities. Hold on, again, there. And at the moment, it's already been launched at a university in Oslo, the Norwegian University of Life Sciences. We also be launched at Lund University. And this is kind of the context is a little bit different for students, of course. They have maybe not as much of a time press. It's also packaged within reading lists and tests and those kind of things. So that, in a nutshell, is what the course is about, the content. And I would say watch this space, CSR Europe, CSR Sweden. We will be announcing when the course is launched. If anybody out there right now is interested in making sure that you don't miss that information, feel free to send me an email at daniel.mensch@csrsweden.se. That's it for me.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for sharing this with us, with the audience. So we hope that many of you among our audience are interested by such course, and we'll get back to Daniel, to Marian, to receive more information. And this will be part of a bigger also a possibility for companies to get the conversation started, but also to access a number of tools and resources also developed by CSR Europe to put in practice responsible tax behavior and receiving the support needed to create the internal buy-in, involve the management, but also engage with stakeholders. So thank you very much for sharing this amazing work with us, Daniel. Thank you also to all the speakers that have joined us today. I saw that many of you have been active in the chat, replying yourself to some of the questions. Of course, if you have more questions for us, for CSR Sweden, please send it to us also via email. Yeah, we hope to continue the discussion. This is just one appointment, but it's very important to speak about tax more and more and more. So thank you very much for being with us, and have a nice evening. Thank you.